Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and today we are going to dig into the movement of supply chains and what you should be considering before you decide to find a new supply location. First, a little bit of background. A recent Gartner survey found that 73% of organizations have added or removed locations from their network over the past 2 years. Similarly, a 2023 AlixPartners survey found that companies are targeting a 40% reduction in their exposure to China and are investing in supplier development, logistics, and distribution footprint changes, among other factors. Accenture has also identified a trend to more localized manufacturing. In 2023 survey, 85% of companies they looked at said they plan to manufacture and sell most of their products in the same region in 2026. Today, that number is 43%. So with so many movements taking place, what can companies do? Well, one thing is they could be making bad decisions if they don't answer some of the underlying questions that should be guiding these moves. Joining me today to discuss this is Nate Rosier. Nate is Senior Vice President of Consulting for enVista. Welcome, Nate. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me on here.
Great. To get started, I think some people may be familiar with enVista, but you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself and enVista and what you guys do?
Sure. enVista is a one-stop shop supply chain consulting business. So we do strategy consulting. We implement pretty much all the solutions you might need for supply chain, including planning, forecasting, supply chain execution, transportation systems, and as well as some ERP and Microsoft. And we also implement automation solutions.
Yep.
I've been doing Vista 11 years. And in those 11 years, I've basically run and built the supply chain strategy group up to one of the largest, as far as I could tell, in the world. And we've been, doing, I've got about 500 clients over the last 11 years that we've been doing work with on just supply chain strategy.
So you're busy. A lot of clients out there that you haven't worked with yet. So guys, sign up.
Non-stop action.
Yeah, so I want to get into this a little bit. We hear a lot, obviously, about reshoring, nearshoring, et cetera, which is part of this big part of this discussion. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into the reasons why companies are nearshoring or reshoring per se. I did provide some stats though in the opening. And so to kick us off, can you kind of give us a high level view of what you're seeing and hearing out there? And those stats to me are kind of surprising in some way that so much is changing. Are you seeing that same thing actually happening in the real world? Is that something that you see as realistic, what those numbers are?
Yes. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that actually the demand patterns have changed. If you think about what has happened from 2019 on, a lot of the demands have changed, and what consumers want has changed dramatically, right? And it's changed, every year since 2019. It's been significant. So, excuse me, one of the things that you kind of run into is, you saw 2020 and then 21, this massive e-com and multi-channel, and then 22, it kept going, and then 23, the big decline, and now here we are. But it hasn't wound back to 2019 demand patterns. So there's actually just a different market for folks who sell to consumers, and I think across the board. And then also on the supply side, there are different types of products that companies are trying to move into. I think there's a goal to reduce the number of SKUs, complexity into the business because it's very expensive. And so that shifted. There is some supplier consolidation on one hand, and then a lot of companies learned about putting too many eggs in one basket, right? They're diversifying, having primary secondaries. And so that's making tremendous shifts across supply chains around the world. And also, the costs of everything have shifted dramatically. Labor, transportation, just storage, real estate, construction of new warehouses, everything has changed dramatically around the world. And so all those things together have basically got all my clients basically moving their networks around a lot.
So who are actually seeing this take place? Sometimes I always get skeptical of surveys sometimes because I wonder if people in surveys are more willing to say things right, than what they're actually doing in some cases. Well, I want to do this, so I'm going to say yes, we do this.
Well, of course they do, but keep in mind that a client may move 1% of their volume from China to Vietnam, and then they would check yes on this.
Yeah,
But it's not much of an impact. But we do see it. Yeah, we see a lot of
yeah.
shifting.
Yeah. I want to get into let's get into the decision-making process here. There are a lot of reasons why a company may shift supply location, and there's so many here. That's a podcast by itself, so we're not going to get into that. We're going to work from the premise, though, that a company has decided to do that. So let's focus on the questions that need to be addressed and asked at that point, right? So where once we've decided, okay, we're making a change, how do we start that process? What is that first question that we need to ask ourselves?
So the first question is, what is the impact overall to my supply chain? Starting from the service level, working your way back to the change in source.
Mhm.
Um, there's quite a bit of analytics that needs to be done. I think transportation is always a moving target, but that might be easier. Trying to understand the change in lead times and shipping schedules and impact to inventory. I mean, the first thing needs to be done is really understanding what the impact is. And so most of my clients, they basically have a list of items that they think are, or suppliers they think are, they'd like to relocate or identify different sources from. And then, what's important is they take that time to go through the math, try to figure out, okay, basically on my expectation, what is that total impact to the business? Um, and then once that total impact of the business is understood, then there's a there's just a transition time, right? You kind of have to have a project plan and go through your transition, typically one or two suppliers at a time, and then figure out what that transition looks like. And if you have risk, right? If you move from one supplier to the other and it's not a clean cutoff, then supplier A may cut you off, prematurely. So you kind of have to come up with what that transition plan looks like, and then from there, I think it's important to iterate, which is, hey, what do we learn from this transition, and what can we do better, and how can we make our analytics better? Because then we'll have real data.
Yeah. And there are you mentioned a number of things there, but there are hundreds of variables, right, to consider when
Mm-hmm.
making these decisions. You touched on transportation a little bit. That there's workforce availability, right? Cost of labor in regions, materials that getting materials, raw materials, products, proximity to customer. I know is a big thing these days in the e-commerce world, right? So what are you seeing, and what are you seeing? What are you hearing from clients that are some of the biggest factors that you believe that companies should be considering there? Is there anything that weighs more than others?
Yes. Always is going to be cost. Cost is going to be an important factor, and that overall cost, right? So you can go potentially to a lower cost region, potentially in Asia. And those are good. The transportation costs, from one part of the world to the other part of the world are always going to remain, they're going to be moving around, but consistent. I think one of the biggest factors is going to be, on top of cost, is cycle time. How much longer am I adding to my supply chain? Because it's becoming harder to connect my demand with supply, and the longer I expand that time from the time I place an order until the time I get the product, my demand patterns change a lot, and trying to compress those is a very important piece. So that's one reason why, many companies are just not coming into the U.S. from Asia, but maybe going to Mexico, right?
Yeah.
Just to cut that time out, because that time is expensive.
And that's very different, right? Depending on the industry. I mean, I'm thinking e-commerce where
Mm,
time is a big deal because you become somewhat of the whim of social media trends that might
yeah.
increase demand rapidly for your product.
Mm. Yeah, and we also see, there are other factors involved. I do have some, clients who are also moving domestic, sourcing over to Asia, right? And so part of that, the time factor there is they have to build up inventory. They
Yeah,
they actually maybe change some of the cost variables, but they have to have more inventory just to deal with that, and they have to have domestic inventory to kind of keep up with the demand patterns. And so you always sort of have this tension between, my cost drivers, my and my cycle times and the ability to plan and forecast. And so when you get into these different variables, it becomes complex. I have had a client briefly, and they had moved sourcing from China to Vietnam, and they didn't realize that change in cycle time would increase their inventory, and they got upside down on their cash flow.
Yeah.
So there are cash flow impacts to these things as well. So
Yeah.
um, so those are all things that companies should be aware of.
So, I mean, I'm guessing it's none of those that you just mentioned, but I wonder, are there factors that companies consider that sometimes they place too much emphasis on?
Yeah. So diversifying your supply base um, is helpful, but can be expensive.
Yeah.
It depends on what you have and what you're trying to go after. And then the other thing that's important, that initial cost is helpful, is interesting, right? It's an important factor, obviously, but having the right inventory at the right place at the right time is worth more than 5% cost reduction or 10% cost reduction. So I think companies do kind of look at that initial cost because it's a hard one that doesn't change as much as transportation or labor or other things. And so they start kind of with that number and then work your way into the other numbers.
Yeah.
But you have to kind of consider the other numbers. And the other thing is that companies consider a lot more now are ports, which is, which port can I rely on and do I have a backup, right? So that's the other thing that companies always have to consider when you think about shifting your supply base.
Yeah. And the last year or so with the ports in the United States, at least we've learned a lot about how important they are. So,
Yeah, yeah, a lot of my clients find out the hard way.
um, so with all these different factors, I know people in general like things easy, right? How do you weigh all these different things? Is there some kind of matrix that you can use that say, hey, this gets 10% weighting, this gets 5%, or is there calculations? How do you go about judging how much to give any individual factor?
So yeah, I mean, definitely would use a matrix. The total cost, right? So the landed cost being one cost, but then what is that total cost is one very key factor. The total cycle time is another key factor. Potential impact to service level, and then the other key matrix is definitely going to be resilience, right? Can I leverage a backup port with this? Do I have is a backup supplier? Do I, can I maintain continuous supply? And then I think there's another piece in there which is a factor is flexibility, right? Because whatever you plan, it's going to change. So, do I have a supply base and supply chain that lets me adapt to that? I mean,
Yeah,
hurricanes are a great example of you have to be able to react to the situation. And I do have clients that, pre-position generators in the area, right? And
yeah,
bottle water, right? I mean, you have to build in some capability to be reactive.
yeah. And I had a guy recently explain to me, we were talking about diversification, right? And how, diversifying your supply chain. He says that some companies don't like it's fine to have two or three suppliers, but if they're all located in the same country, are you really diversified? Right? Because
Yeah,
something happens to
well,
that country, it's a problem.
yeah, well, and so there's a lot of complexity built into it. So if
Yeah,
you have a factory in China and you have two factories in China, okay, that's helpful. But what's nice is a lot of times you're using the same port, same shipping schedule, you can use the same transportation, you get good visibility. You take one of those factories, move it to Vietnam. Now the transportation problem has gotten more than double, right?
yeah,
It's very complex to kind of manage that. So, but it's true, right? Yeah, a lot of these factories, especially in China, they're close to each other. they're,
yeah.
they're in the same town.
So if something happens,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, something
So I mean
happens.
that,
And
those are types of things also that go into the decision making process too. I
yeah,
assume as well.
yeah,
Lots to think about there. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because this is always you've already talked about total cost, right, of everything. Switching suppliers or relocating a factory, the cost to do that can add up quickly, at least initially.
Mhm.
Many governments, though, want to encourage investment in their community, so they offer incentives, right? I mean, there may be tax breaks for 2 years, for instance, or we give you the land. I mean, whatever the incentive is to get a company there to build a facility or put a facility there. But you know, those things can look really attractive, I think, initially.
Mhm.
But how far out do companies, I think, need to look at that investment, right? I mean, a 2-year tax break is great for the first 2 years, but over 10 years, is it actually cheaper to have the facility in that location, right? Is it just cheaper the first 2 years?
Yeah, you're bringing up a great point, which is, how do you consider tax break in the overall factor? And I can give you the experience I have with my clients, which is, um, it's really a tertiary factor. Um, Basically, when they want to make a change to the supply base and maybe move to more tax advantageous location, something else triggered it, right?
Mhm.
And that's the primary cost driver. And then secondary after that is it's a good location where I've got good supply of labor. I've got good overall costs. Like in general, it's good. And then the tax breaks are really tertiary, which is okay. Based on that, what are my economics and how can I create that? So it's not a primary even secondary factor typically. Now there may be exceptions to that. I don't I don't work in every industry, but I know in most of the areas I look at, it's really tertiary.
Okay, so that may be it may be something to get a company to look at an area, but it probably should not be the primary decision to put a facility
No,
in an area then.
and it virtually never. I mean, I'm unaware of any scenario where that's true. Maybe there may be other industries I don't work in,
Yeah.
like building, chip factories. That might be they may do that, but the areas I work in, then that's
Yeah, I think that's interesting to hear. I think because we always hear as I consider myself a layman, right, in some ways, but we hear about how important tax breaks are from governments to get business in the area, and whatnot. And certainly local businesses, I think, is probably a different scenario as opposed to
mhm.
global businesses. Um, you're talking millions and billions of dollars of revenues and investments.
Yeah,
Um,
no, yeah, and these are huge strategic long-term
yeah,
investments, right? And governments change and different things happen. So they're done for reasons outside of taxes,
yeah.
typically.
There are certainly outside Texas. There certainly are situations where moving to another supplier or region is going to add costs. You've mentioned some transportation, logistics, labor is another big one, right? Some areas are more expensive to operate in than others.
Mhm.
Workforce is more expensive. But sometimes the companies just need to do it, right? There may be some reason why they have to put a facility in this location. So in those situations where they're relocating a facility or going to a new supplier where there is going to be those added costs, what kind of levers does that company have to kind of minimize that financial impact, or is that something they just have to eat and they just build it into the cost of their goods sold?
Well, if you're moving into a higher cost area, one way to leverage it is to build the basically build the business case one of two ways. So sometimes you move to an area and the costs in general are higher. A lot of times it makes it easier to simplify and focus that operation into
Mhm.
something straightforward. So that way, um, you don't have a lot of added costs, right? If you simplify it enough, a lot of times you can minimize a lot of those costs. And instead of manufacturing one area or trying to have a massive multi-channel distribution, potentially you can have something that's more focused just on wholesale or e-com or something like that. So
Right.
there are ways to kind of mitigate your costs that way. And the other way is to leverage in reverse, which is just if you're trying to move something onshore because for whatever reason you need it onshore, now that I've compressed my cycle time from domestic demand to supply, then next thing you know, I've got some flexibility
Yeah.
and I can do fill in and I can do other work like that. So those are kind of the two ways we see it, but that simplification and keep them focused. I've had clients that move from Costa Rica to Mexico, right? And it was a relatively complex operation. And when we moved to Mexico, it did save some time, and some things around money, and there was other factors involved. But they started with a very simple operation, And every time they tried to make it too complex, it got costly. But if they made it very simple, it was fine. It worked great, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of what they learned from that.
Yeah. So other business decisions that can go into this,
Yeah.
to make a decision. Um, we saw after COVID, we saw a lot of companies like make knee-jerk reaction, just move facilities all over the place, right? Because
Yeah.
of countries shutting down, et cetera. But can you kind of talk about in a non-COVID time, if you will, right? What the typical timeline is for when you start considering and exploring a potential move of a facility or supplier, and wait, and how when does that actually take place? What does that timeline look like typically?
So when you're rethinking your supply chain and redesigning, you really need to think 9 to 18 months out
Hmm.
um, to complete everything. Basically, because you have to have the time up front to do the analytics, do the research, identify your different locations and what the pros and cons benefits are going to be. So that's a couple months. And then from there, once you've identified your alternative supplier or the areas you're going to shift into, you have to go through execution. And all those transitions have to be crawl, walk, run, right? You never want to just pick up and shift rapidly. It creates a lot of disruption and typically bad service levels, right? So 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 that's what we normally look at as 9 to 18 months. I've seen supply chains completely change in 24 months, and that's everything. That was more rare situation, and I've seen small moves done in 5 months. But normally you want to kind of plan out what you're going to do. So you come into your planning cycle for the next year. Say, look, one of our key goals is to relocate from as a percentage of our stuff coming from China over to another country. And then from that perspective, like I said, you got a few months of just analytics and identifying your alternative supply, what that looks like, designing what that future state's going to be, and then start the transition. So that's that's at least 9 months.
Yeah. So from a budgeting standpoint, you're really looking at kind of a 2-year budget cycle in essence, right?
Yes.
For
Yeah, I
that.
would take a look at 2 year. Yeah,
Yeah.
completely.
I want to ask one final question because I've done a lot of these podcasts and talked to a lot of people on various things, right? Moving facilities, reshoring, nearshoring, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that I rarely ever talk to anybody about is the employees involved in this process. Um, I'm wondering, certainly if you relocate a facility or you switch suppliers, employees are affected by that, right? I mean, they may be losing their jobs, they may have to relocate to a new
Mm,
location, depending on their choices. So I'm wondering though, if you can talk a little bit about the impact on employees and the important part of employee relationship to this, because I think it's not just the employees that have to relocate or might lose their job that are affected. It's also the other employees that are staying behind, right? That still have jobs
yeah.
and maybe sitting there thinking about, well, are they going to send my job somewhere now? And now
Hmm.
suddenly that employee goodwill, right, is kind of diminishing a little bit. So, what kind of advice can you give from an employee relationship part of this process to deal with all the employees in your organization?
So I would say the first thing is when thinking about you know employee relations is to have a good solid plan before you talk to the employees.
Mhm.
And by that, you don't want to change the story a couple times because this didn't work out, that didn't work out. So, which happens a lot, right?
And doesn't build trust with
Yeah,
employees,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And then you lose trust and credibility, and
Yeah.
and so you want to have a well thought out plan before you talk to the associates. And then the next thing that's going to be important is transparency, so they understand here's what's happening, why, the pros and cons. Um, if they're associates in the United States, there seem to be plenty of jobs for for folks now. I know it's everybody's affected, and there's a lot of transition, and it's challenging, but I can tell you that that's been my experience in today's environment, that if something gets shut down in one area, there's plenty of other employers that will hire you
Yeah.
in those areas. So, but then it's just transition and how that works. And then, I think it's important that the folks that are staying behind, that to understand, they understand their role, that they're treated appropriately as part of the team, right? And this is what's happening as part of the transition. I've seen a lot of times where And I've seen this a lot where, they're going to move half the business to someplace else. And so they picked up half the business, they laid off half the associates, and the business went to, another country or whatever. And then demand picked up in a certain area and it all came domestic and all those people got hired back in like 6 months.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that story's happened a few times. It's not isolated. You don't really know things can happen all the time. So you always want to have a good transparent way of communication, excuse me, and make sure that, the folks work well. I tell you, most of my success in my career has been working, building effective teams and leading teams. And, one of the important things about teams is trust. And so you have to make sure that once you have a good plan, then you're able to address it and let the team be part of that. Say, okay, here's how as a team we resolve that, how we work together, and not just as individuals or a lot of the folks that work in these operations are temporary associates as well, right? But they're part of the team. They're part of the value creation of it. So making sure that that's sort of transparent communication. Here's what's happening. Here's the timeline. Here's what it looks like, and then making sure you've got the right type of retention plan and everything for the folks that are going to stay behind is all important. But I've seen it. I know a lot of my clients, I think, are doing a better job of working with their associates, and I feel better about. I think we've gotten better at addressing their needs, but you know, in any situation where you've got a lot of transition, there's always opportunity for other things, right? There are ways potentially to make the job more rewarding or more effective, or because you're in a transition, right? So maybe you can take some of the noise out of the system and make an operation, easier to run or easier to manage or a better place to work. So that's what I've seen is from a best practice standpoint.
Yeah, and I would just say, as someone, I mean, you obviously have too. I mean, I've worked for years for different companies and whatnot, and
Mhm,
just knowing people in general, communication, you can only be so transparent, right? I mean, you can't give away certain things. I think most
mhm.
employees understand that, but I think if there's a void of communication, then what happens is the employees make fill those gaps, right? And
Every time.
that's where rumor and innuendo starts coming in, and right,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you've lost control of the narrative as to what's actually happening out
Mhm.
there, and whatnot. So I think, like, just from an employee perspective, be as transparent as you can with the employees and communicate and make sure they understand what's going on, so that they don't create their own scenarios as to what's going on.
Yeah, no,
So,
I think some of the more difficult situations are where the analytics and trying to decide what to do takes a long time and rumors get around and
yeah,
and then a company might change direction once or twice. All those situations do make it difficult. So yeah, I mean, I think you got to make sure that you have a plan, and once you have the plan, talk through the plan, but have them work as a team, to kind of help you execute the plan. That always works better.
yeah.
So
Yeah. Thank you for the time today, Nate. Greatly appreciated it. There is so much more to these decisions than what we talked about today, obviously. These are massive projects. That's why there's consultants like you guys out there to kind of go through all this stuff. It's unfortunately you can't make a decision on moving a facility in 30 minutes, but wish you could. I bet everybody loved you. Could wish you could do it, but it can't be done. But we are out of time. Thanks, Nate. So if people want to get in touch with enVista, what would be the best way to do that?
yeah, what would be great is to come to our website, enVista Corp, ENVISTACORP.com, and you can see our offerings and reach out to us, and happy to have a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate. Thank you for joining us. I greatly appreciate it.
All
Uh,
right, great, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. I want to thank Nate Rosier from enVista for joining me today, and a special thank you to all of you who took time out of your day to listen. We greatly appreciate it and appreciate you taking time with us. New episodes of Talking Supply Chain come out on Thursdays. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.